I stood in the driveway, my hands still throbbing from where the door had slammed against it. The car's engine hummed as my son's laughter echoed from the driver's seat. "You're clumsy, Mom," he had said, like it was nothing. After everything I'd done for him, after all the years of sacrifice, love, and patience, he thought nothing of breaking me. And for the first time I understood. This wasn't just a door, this was the beginning of him breaking everything else. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The slam wasn't just metal against metal, it was bone against steel. Marjorie Ellis's sharp cry pierced the quiet Cleveland driveway, startling a robin from the hedge, but earning only a smirk from the man behind the wheel. Brian Ellis didn't even flinch. He leaned back, tapping the steering wheel as though impatient with a red light, rather than his mother's pain. "What? You weren't paying attention," he muttered, the corners of his mouth twitching upward. Her right hand throbbed, trapped for a moment between the car door and frame, before she yanked it free. The skin was already bruising purple, swelling fast. Marge stared at the angry imprint, her breath catching, then lifted her eyes to her son. He was watching her, watching to see if she'd make a scene. From the passenger seat, Kara Ellis, hair perfectly ironed and lipstick too bright for a Saturday morning, rolled her eyes. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she drawled. "So dramatic." "It was an accident, Marjorie." Marge didn't answer. She pressed her lips together, silence louder than any curse. Pain hummed up her arm like electricity, but fury sank deeper, heavier. At 69, she'd been called many things: steady, quiet, dependable, but never weak. Her son might think her bones brittle, her patience endless. He was wrong. The groceries still sat in the back seat, bags rustling as the breeze tugged at them. Marge forced her voice calm. "I'll take mine inside." She didn't ask for help, didn't give him the satisfaction. She scooped the bags with her good hand and staggered toward the porch, knees stiff from years of postal routes, but her back straight. Brian revved the engine once, almost theatrically, and called after her, "Don't take it out on me if you're clumsy." Kara's laugh, a quick sharp snip of sound, trailed as the car rolled out of the driveway. Inside, Marge lowered the bags to the kitchen counter and peeled back her sleeve. The swelling had bloomed grotesque already, skin blotched like ink spreading through paper. She hissed softly, cradling her hand against her chest. For a moment tears pricked her eyes. Not from the pain that she could endure, from the humiliation. Her phone buzzed. A name lit up the screen: Louise Grant. Marge debated answering, but her oldest friend never let calls slide. She swiped. "Lou," she said, voice strained. "What's wrong with you?" Louise demanded. "You sound like you swallowed glass." Marge swallowed hard. "Brian," it was all she needed to say. 10 minutes later, Louise's dusty blue buick crunched up the driveway. She marched through the back door without knocking, eyes sharp behind square glasses. When she saw Marge's hand, she stopped cold. "Jesus, Marge. Did he do that?" Marge didn't trust herself to speak. She set the kettle on the stove, the hiss of the burner filling the space where her words wouldn't come. Louise sat down hard at the kitchen table. "You're telling me he slammed a door on you, and then laughed at his mother?" Finally Marge turned. Her voice was low, steady, but it carried something new, something that made Louise straighten. "If he treats me like this, Lou, he'll learn pain another way." The kettle whistled, but neither woman moved to silence it. The sound was shrill, unending, like the anger running beneath Marge's calm face. Louise reached into her purse, fumbling past old receipts and a packet of mints. When she pulled her hand back out, something small and rectangular gleamed between her fingers. She didn't push it across the table immediately. She let it rest in her palm, heavy with implication. "Marge," she said, her tone deliberate, "I know someone who listens, someone who doesn't scare easy." Marge lifted her chin. "A lawyer." Louise nodded. Finally she pushed the card across the wood grain. The white rectangle slid forward until it rested at the edge of Marge's tea saucer. The name was printed in bold black letters: Daniel Hurst, attorney at law. Marge stared at it, her hand throbbing, her heart steady. The kettle screamed behind her, steam curling like a signal. And for the first time since the slam of that car door, her lips curved, not into a smile, but into the faintest, most dangerous smirk. The office smelled faintly of old wood and sharp coffee, 2 scents Marjorie Ellis had always associated with seriousness. The blinds filtered the September sun into thin stripes across Daniel Hurst's desk, and she felt the weight of every line as though the room itself were judging her silence. She slid her hand out from beneath her sweater sleeve. The swelling was ugly now. The bruising spread like oil stains across the knuckles. Daniel's eyes flicked down, registering every detail. Unlike Brian's, they didn't flinch or mock. They measured. "You're certain he slammed the door intentionally?" His voice was calm, neutral, but his gaze was steady, waiting. Marge nodded once. "He laughed," she said. Her voice cracked on the word, not from weakness, but from the memory. Louise, seated beside her, leaned forward, with her elbows on the desk. "He's been pushing her around for years, Daniel. Money, guilt, disrespect. Now he thinks he can break bones too." Daniel tapped the end of his pen against a yellow legal pad. A rhythm, deliberate. "This isn't just assault," he said at last, his voice gaining edge. He looked directly at Marge. "This is leverage." Marge blinked. "Leverage?" He leaned back, tenting his fingers. "Abuse like this, it's rarely in isolation. It's a pattern. If we dig, I expect we'll find fraud, coercion, theft. The physical injury gives us an opening. From there," his mouth twitched into a half smirk, "we pull the thread." Marge inhaled slowly. She had come here to be heard, to show the damage, but the possibility of exposing more, dragging the hidden into daylight, felt intoxicating. "Then let's pull it." Her purse sat at her feet, stuffed heavy with what she had gathered over the last year. Statements, letters, check registers she hadn't wanted to believe revealed what they revealed. She bent down, unzipped it, and laid a stack of folders on the desk. "I've kept records," she said. "Too many nights I told myself I was imagining things," but she pushed the papers closer. "I wasn't." Louise smirked and sat back, satisfied. "He's been bleeding her dry, Daniel. You'll see." Daniel flipped open a folder, his eyes moving faster now, taking in forged notations, duplicate withdrawals, expenses that didn't belong. His jaw tightened with each page. "He's sloppy," he murmured, more to himself than to them. "Sloppy is good. Sloppy means we catch him." He looked up again. "Marge, if you're ready for this, we can do more than press charges. We can dismantle his entire scheme, piece by piece." Marge's lips pressed into a thin, unyielding line. The pain in her hand pulsed with every heartbeat, but her voice was firm. "Bring the gavel down." For a moment silence filled the room. The tick of a wall clock punctuated it, as though confirming her words. Then Daniel nodded, sliding the folders into a neat stack. "Good. We start now." The next morning, Brian Ellis strolled into the credit union on Lorraine Avenue with the kind of swagger he saved for situations he thought he controlled. He carried his mother's checkbook like a prize, his handwriting clumsy but confident across the slip. He whistled as the teller processed the withdrawal. "Big day?" she asked, her smile polite. "You could say that," Brian replied. He tapped his fingers against the counter, his grin widening as the bills slid across the glass. "Vacation fund." He stuffed the cash into his pocket, never noticing the faint hesitation in the teller's eyes as she filed away the signature. By the time Marge returned home from Daniel's office later that afternoon, her phone buzzed with a message alert from the bank. The words made her stomach tighten. "Recent withdrawal. $3,500. Signature on file." She froze in her kitchen, staring at the text. Her hand, still bound in a compression wrap, clenched at her side. She hadn't signed a damn thing. The slam of the car door had been brutal, humiliating. But this was theft, dressed in her name, and as her chest burned with fury, she realized Brian had just handed her attorney the exact rope they needed to hang him in court. The paper trembled in Marjorie Ellis's bandaged hand, not because she was frail, but because rage carried weight. The bank statement smelled faintly of toner, the edges still warm from the printer. Line by line, it documented a theft wearing her name, like a mask. She set it on the kitchen table under the glare of the overhead light. Her signature, if you could call it that, was scrawled at the bottom of the withdrawal slip. Letters crooked, angles wrong, her careful loops butchered into jagged scratches. It was a child's imitation of a language they hadn't learned. Louise leaned over her shoulder, her reading glasses perched at the end of her nose. "Well, damn," she muttered. "He didn't even try to make it convincing." Marge exhaled slowly, her lips pressed into a flat, bloodless line. "He thinks I'm too scared to challenge him. Then let's make sure he's wrong." By late afternoon, the two women sat across from Daniel Hurst again. His desk was cleaner than most lawyers' offices Marge had ever imagined. No clutter, no stale coffee cups, just neat stacks of files, and one glass paperweight that caught the slant of sun. He adjusted his cufflinks, glanced at the forged slip, and chuckled once, low. "This is gift-wrapped," he said, tapping the page with his pen. "Not only assault, but financial fraud tied directly to his name. Banks take forgery very seriously." Marge's hand throbbed against its wrap, but she didn't flinch. She leaned forward. "Can we stop him?" Daniel's eyes narrowed in that calculating way Marge was starting to recognize. Part predator, part craftsman. "We don't just stop him. We cut him off." Louise grinned like a cat that had cornered a mouse. "Ironclad now, Marge. He's boxed himself in." Meanwhile, across town, Brian Ellis sat in his recliner, nursing a beer, a smug smile tugging at his lips. Kara perched on the armrest, scrolling her phone with nails painted sharp red. "She won't do anything," Brian muttered, half to himself. "She never does. Always folds when I push." Kara's laugh was bright, almost musical, but carried an edge like broken glass. "And thanks to her, babe, we've got our vacation fund." She waved her phone, showing off a post she'd just uploaded. A sun emoji, a cocktail glass, and the caption counting down to beach time. Brian chuckled, the sound sloppy with arrogance. He raised his bottle. "Too easy money." Neither noticed the storm assembling against them. The next morning, Daniel filed the paperwork. His signature was precise, each stroke purposeful, as if he took satisfaction in every letter. Fraud complaint, submitted evidence, attached, request for account freeze initiated. As the clerk stamped the forms, Marge stood behind him, her bruised hand throbbing beneath its wrap. She had expected fear, but what rose instead was a strange steadiness, almost relief. For the first time in years, she wasn't reacting, she was striking back. Daniel turned, his smile faint but lethal. "The wheels are in motion. He won't know what hit him until it's already done." Louise clasped Marge's good hand. "You hear that? He's about to choke on his own arrogance." That evening, Brian swiped his debit card at a gas station, tapping his foot impatiently as the pump clicked. The screen flashed. Declined. He frowned, swiped again. Harder. Declined. "What the hell?" he snapped, slamming the card against the counter when he stormed inside. The clerk just shrugged. "Bored. Talk to your bank." Brian's face flushed red as Kara's phone buzzed with another notification. She glanced at the screen, her smile faltering. "Brian, there's a hold on the account," he cursed, punching the steering wheel when they climbed back into the truck. She wouldn't dare, but she had. Back in her kitchen, Marge poured herself a cup of coffee. The rich scent filled the room, stronger than the sting in her hand. She set the mug beside her phone, just as the bank notification chimed. "Account status, frozen pending fraud investigation." The words glowed on the screen like a gavel slamming down. Marge stared at them, the steam from her coffee curling into the air. For the first time since the car door crushed her bones, she allowed herself a smile, sharp, dangerous, unshaken. The plastic screeched against the register as Brian Ellis swiped his debit card for the third time, his jaw tight enough to crack teeth. A red message blinked across the grocery store's screen. Transaction declined. The cashier gave him a thin smile that wasn't quite sympathetic. "Sir, maybe you want to try another card," she offered. Brian's face flushed beet red. Behind him a line of customers shuffled impatiently, carts squeaking, whispers rising. He slammed the card down on the counter. "There's money in that account. Run it again." The screen didn't change. Declined. Kara, standing beside him with a basket heavy with wine and skin creams, let out a shriek that drew every eye in the checkout lane. "Are you kidding me, Brian? What the hell is this?" Her voice cracked like glass, high and grating. People stared, murmured. A teenager snickered into his hoodie. Brian shoved the bags away, stormed out of the store, and Kara clattered after him in her heels. At the very same hour, across Cleveland, Marjorie Ellis sat calmly at her dining table, her bandaged hand steady over the paperwork Daniel had brought. The blinds swayed with a soft lake breeze. The documents bore her name, clean and precise, and for once she felt it belonged to her again. Daniel's pen scratched across the page as he guided her through signatures. "This transfers the remainder into a protected trust," he explained. "He can't touch it. Not without coming through me first." Marge nodded, each stroke of her signature deliberate, her good hand moving slowly but firmly. The sting in her injured one only sharpened her focus. She wasn't giving Brian another penny to squander. Louise watched from the corner, arms crossed, satisfaction bright in her eyes. "He's already choking, Marge. He just doesn't know how deep the water is yet." By the time Brian and Kara burst into their kitchen that evening, his temper had reached full boil. He flung his keys against the counter, the metal clattering across granite. She froze it. The old bat froze it all. Kara paced like a caged cat, her bracelets clinking with every furious gesture. "How are we supposed to pay rent now, Brian? How am I supposed to live like this? You promised." "I'll fix it," he snapped, pounding his fist on the table. "She thinks she's clever. She thinks some lawyer can save her. But she doesn't know who she's dealing with." He yanked open a drawer, pulling out a file of crumpled papers, his hands shaking. Among them lay a document stamped with notary ink. Kara leaned closer, her eyes narrowing. "What is that?" Brian's smirk returned, sharp and ugly. "Insurance." Back at Daniel's office the next morning, the air was thick with the faint scent of leather and paper. Daniel sorted through the new documents Marge had signed, his movements efficient, precise. He set them into a file marked Ellis versus Ellis. "You're protected now," he told her. "He'll find the accounts shut down, his access revoked, his signature flagged. The bank has already been notified." Marge allowed herself a long exhale. "For the first time in years, I don't feel like I'm one step behind him." Daniel gave a faint, predatory smile. "Now he's one step behind us." Across town, Brian was anything but calm. He stormed into the kitchen, his face blotched red, his voice shaking the walls. Kara shrank back against the counter as he shouted, "You'll pay for this, Mom. You hear me? You'll pay for every goddamn cent." His spit flecked against the tile, his fists clenched at his sides, but his rage was wasted in the empty air. Marge wasn't there to hear him. Later that night, Daniel spread Brian's documents across his desk. He'd requested them from the county clerk, suspecting more than simple fraud. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, highlighting every inkstroke, his brow furrowed as he leaned closer. One paper in particular stood out, a neatly notarized power of attorney, bearing Marjorie Ellis's name at the bottom. Except Daniel compared it against the bank slip. The signature was just as clumsy, just as crooked. Louise, sitting across from him, raised an eyebrow. "Don't tell me he actually tried it." Daniel's lips curled into a humorless smile. He filed fake power of attorney paperwork, and he thought no one would notice. The forged document looked innocent enough, clean notary stamp, neat typeface, clipped staples, but to Daniel Hurst's practiced eye, it glowed like a live grenade. He slid the paper across his desk toward Marjorie Ellis, tapping the clumsy scrawl of her name at the bottom. "This," he said, voice tight, "isn't just sloppy paperwork. This is criminal fraud. Marge." Her throat tightened as she studied the signature, a warped imitation of her careful penmanship. Her stomach twisted with a mix of fury and disbelief. "He filed this with the county. With my name?" Daniel nodded, sliding the file back into its folder. "He's declared himself your decision maker. Finances, property, even medical choices. If a bank clerk or hospital took this at face value, Brian could strip you bare in a week." Louise let out a low whistle, shaking her head. "He's not just playing games anymore, Marge. He's trying to erase you." Marge straightened, the bandage on her hand peeking from her sleeve. "Then let's make sure he's erased instead." 2 days later, the fluorescent lights of the Cleveland courthouse glared down on polished floors and rows of benches filled with strangers waiting for their turn. The air smelled faintly of dust and disinfectant. Marge sat between Louise and Daniel at the petitioner's table, her injured hand resting in plain sight, while Brian swaggered in through the double doors. He wore a suit that didn't quite fit, collar askew, tie knot sloppy. Kara trailed behind him, chewing her lip, but her eyes gleamed with a kind of perverse excitement, as if the courtroom itself were a stage for their drama. When Brian spotted his mother seated confidently with counsel at her side, his mouth curled into a sneer. He whispered something to Kara, then puffed his chest out like a prizefighter entering the ring. Judge Matthews, a woman with steel-gray hair and a voice that cut through chatter like a blade, shuffled papers on her bench. "We're here to review the validity of a power of attorney filed by Mr. Brian Ellis on behalf of Miss Marjorie Ellis. Allegations of forgery are before the court." Brian shot to his feet before Daniel could even speak. "Your Honor, my mother's confused. She's 70, almost senile. She doesn't understand half of what she signs anymore. I had to step in for her sake." Gasps rippled faintly through the benches. Marge's jaw clenched, but she didn't rise. Daniel only adjusted his tie, calm, waiting. Finally he stood. "With respect, Your Honor, we have medical documentation proving Miss Ellis is of sound mind and body." And further, he held up the forged document with a gloved hand. "This signature doesn't match hers by any legal standard." He handed the paper to the bailiff, who delivered it to the bench. Judge Matthews studied the ink, her eyes narrowing. Daniel turned slightly, nodding at Marge. "Miss Ellis, would you present your letter?" Marge rose, every step deliberate, heels clicking against the tile. She placed the sealed envelope in the judge's hand. Inside was her physician's letter, unequivocally stating she was competent, independent, and fully capable of managing her own affairs. As the judge scanned it, Brian's face darkened, his bravado slipping. "She's lying. She's sick. She doesn't know what she's doing," he barked. Louise leaned close to Marge, her whisper sharp as a knife. Now he's cornered. Judge Matthews's gavel came down hard, the crack echoing across the chamber. "Mr. Ellis, the court finds this power of attorney to be fraudulent. Effective immediately, you are stripped of any authority regarding your mother's assets or decisions." She paused, her gaze unflinching. "Furthermore, these actions justify referral to civil fraud proceedings." Brian stumbled back into his chair, the color draining from his face. Kara stared at him as if he'd turned into a stranger. Marge remained standing, her bruised hand resting lightly on the table. For the first time, Brian looked smaller than the room, smaller than the mother he had tried to silence with a slam of a car door. And now, with the gavel still vibrating through the wood, the case was set to move forward into a trial that could bleed him dry. The courtroom air was heavy, the kind of silence that hummed just before thunder. Brian Ellis sat rigid in the defendant's chair, a place he had once imagined reserved for criminals, not for himself. His knee bounced under the table, hands gripping the wood so tightly his knuckles blanched. Across from him, Marjorie Ellis sat perfectly still. Her posture was not rigid with fear, but deliberate with composure, her bandaged hand resting on the table in plain view. The bruising, now yellowing around the edges, caught the light each time she shifted. It was a silent exhibit, one that spoke louder than any lawyer's words. Daniel Hurst, calm and methodical, rose from his chair. He moved with the precision of a surgeon, every word measured as he addressed the court. Your Honor, we are not here because of a simple family disagreement. We are here because a man exploited his own mother. The evidence, documents, financial records, medical testimony shows a clear pattern of fraud and abuse. Brian's jaw clenched. Kara leaned toward him, her perfume sharp and cloying in the stale courtroom air. She whispered fast, her words tripping over themselves. They don't have anything. Just stay calm, Brian. Don't give them. Mrs. Ellis. Judge Matthews's voice cut through the tension. Marge rose slowly. Her heels clicked against the tile, steady and unhurried. She stood tall before the courtroom, her face calm, her voice quiet enough that everyone leaned forward to hear. My son slammed a car door on my hand. Then he laughed at me. That was the beginning of this. But it wasn't the beginning of his taking. Her eyes swept across the room, not dramatic but firm. For years he's used my money as if it were his. He's forged my name, he's mocked me when I asked questions. And when I refused to play along, he tried to erase me with a false document, claiming I couldn't make my own choices. She held up her injured hand. This is what he left me with. Bruises on my skin and emptiness in my accounts. The silence afterward felt heavy enough to crack the walls. Brian's face turned scarlet. He shot out of his chair, fists slamming the table. She's lying. She's twisting everything. She doesn't even know what she's saying. The sound of the gavel exploded like a gunshot. Judge Matthews glared down, eyes hard. Outburst recorded. Sit down, Mr. Ellis, or you'll be removed. Brian slumped back, muttering curses under his breath. Kara touched his arm, but he shook her off. Daniel stepped forward again, unshaken. His voice carried the weight of inevitability. Your Honor, my client has lived in fear of her own son's control. But fear is not the law. Fraud is. Abuse is. We are requesting this matter move forward to trial, not just for injunction, but for damages and restitution. The judge adjusted her glasses, flipping through the documents Daniel had laid before her. She tapped her pen twice, then looked up. Motion granted. Trial date will be set for restitution and damages. Louise exhaled sharply beside Marge, whispering, he thought he could wiggle free. Now he's chained to that chair. Brian sat frozen, the reality sinking in. The chair beneath him, once just a piece of furniture, now felt like a trap he couldn't rise from. The first whispers started on Maplewood Drive, before the court clerk's ink on the order was even dry. By the following week, everyone from the mail carrier to the man who ran the corner hardware store seemed to know that Brian Ellis was being dragged into court by his own mother. Louise, of course, made sure of it. She stood in her driveway, garden gloves tucked into her back pocket, giving updates as if she were the neighborhood's news anchor. Fraud, forged papers, bank accounts frozen, she told Mrs. Green, from 2 doors down, her voice carrying just enough for others to overhear. And the judge saw through him like a dirty window. By the time Louise moved on to chat with the couple across the street, word had spread like wildfire. Eyes lingered longer when Brian drove past. Conversations hushed, then swelled again the moment he disappeared around the corner. Kara tried to fight back against the gossip with the same sharp charm she used at dinner parties. She smiled too wide at the local boutique, told anyone who would listen that it was all a terrible misunderstanding. She even suggested Marge had been pressured by that meddling friend and a greedy lawyer. But the performance faltered when the clerk at the cash register raised an eyebrow. Didn't see the judge calling it a misunderstanding, the young woman said flatly. Kara's cheeks flushed hot, her practiced laugh collapsing into silence. Marge, meanwhile, carried on with quiet dignity. She shopped at the grocery store like always, her cart rolling steadily down the aisles. But this time something different happened. A cashier who had once barely acknowledged her, now leaned forward and whispered, "Good for you, Mrs. Ellis." An older neighbor, Mr. Cunningham, tipped his ball cap in her direction as she loaded milk into her cart. "Takes guts to stand up like that." Each nod, Each whispered word filled her not with pride, but with a calm certainty. The shame Brian had tried to bury her under was unraveling in public, on his back, not hers. Brian felt it. He saw the stares, heard the murmurs. One evening, he stormed out to take the trash cans to the curb, only to notice two teenagers across the street holding their phones up. He barked, "What are you looking at?" and nearly dropped the bin when one of them shouted back, "Court TV, starring you." Paranoia seeped into his days. He kept his blinds drawn, flinched when the mail arrived, cursed at the ringing phone. His swagger dulled into pacing footsteps across the kitchen floor, the sound of a man shrinking inside his own house. Kara grew restless, snapping at him in clipped tones. "You've embarrassed me, Brian. Do you even realize how pathetic you look?" While Brian unraveled, Daniel Hurst grew sharper. He compiled witness statements from neighbors who had overheard shouting, cashiers who remembered Marge's forged transactions, and even bank employees willing to testify about the inconsistencies. His office filled with manila folders and color-coded tabs, the scent of printer ink and coffee thick in the air. One evening, Louise sat in his office beside Marge, watching Daniel organize another stack. "You've got him pinned to the mat," she muttered, smirking. Daniel glanced up, calm but precise. "Pinned, yes, but not finished. Men like Brian don't quit until they're forced to." That prophecy arrived sooner than expected. Marge was sipping tea at her kitchen table when the envelope slid through the mail slot. It was thicker than most, the seal official. She tore it open carefully, scanning the words once then twice, her stomach sinking. Notice of lien, property held against outstanding debts filed by Brian Ellis. Her house, her modest, steady home on Maplewood Drive, was suddenly tethered to her son's reckless borrowing. The mug trembled in her hand as Louise snatched the paper away, her eyes widening. "That son of a—" She caught herself, her face pale. "Marge, he tied your roof to his debts." The kettle whistled again on the stove, shrill and unrelenting, but this time it wasn't anger. Marge heard in its scream. It was warning. The paper shook in Marjorie Ellis's hand, but not from weakness. It was the tremor of fury held taut, the kind that comes when a violation cuts deeper than skin, a lien on her house. Not just numbers on a page, but a claim against the walls she had built her life inside, the porch she had swept every morning, the room still echoing with her late husband's laughter. Louise slammed her coffee cup onto the table, hard enough to slosh liquid over the rim. "That he mortgaged your roof for his gambling debts." Her voice cracked with outrage, slicing through the stillness of the kitchen. Marge didn't answer immediately. She folded the notice carefully, deliberately, and set it on the table between them. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, steady as iron. "He thought bruising my hand was enough. Now he wants to strip me bare." Louise leaned forward, her expression fierce. "Then we don't let him. We burn this little trick to the ground." By noon they were in Daniel Hurst's office. The blinds were half drawn, slats of afternoon light cutting across his desk. He read the lien notice twice, then again, jaw tightening. "This," Daniel said, tapping the page, "is fraud layered on fraud. He had no legal authority to borrow against this property. The fact that the county clerk even processed it shows how convincing he tried to be." Marge's good hand clenched on the arm of her chair. "Can you stop it?" Daniel's eyes sharpened, a glint of ruthlessness flashing beneath his calm demeanor. "Not stop, void." He slid the notice into a folder and stood, already moving toward his assistant's desk. "We file a fraud affidavit today. By tomorrow this lien is nothing but ash." Louise smirked, satisfied. "Let's see how Brian handles having his little toy yanked away." The next day Brian Ellis found out exactly how. He stormed into the kitchen, the notice from the court crumpled in his fist. "Voided? How the hell can they void it?" Kara, perched at the counter in silk pajamas, narrowed her eyes. "You said this was foolproof, Brian. You told me we'd have leverage." He shoved the paper at her, face flushed crimson. "She got that damn lawyer involved. He's tearing me apart." Her shriek rattled the air, shrill and jagged. "Do you realize what this looks like? To everyone, You can't even handle your own mother. You've dragged me into your mess, Brian. I can't show my face in this neighborhood without people whispering." Brian ripped the paper in half, then into quarters, the pieces fluttering to the floor like snow. He shouted at the ceiling, voice cracking with rage, "This isn't over, Mom. You'll pay for this." But his words sounded smaller than the walls that trapped them. That same evening, Marge sat calmly at her table, sipping coffee Louise had poured. The bitterness on her tongue was sharp but grounding. She set her mug down, looked at Louise, and said softly, "He slammed my hand. Now the hammer falls." Louise raised her cup in a mock toast, lips curling into a grin. "To hammers." A week later, the Cleveland courthouse buzzed with the clatter of shoes on tile and murmurs that bounced off marble walls. Daniel guided Marge and Louise into the courtroom, a thick file of evidence under his arm. Judge Matthews adjusted her glasses as Daniel laid out the fraud affidavit, the forged power of attorney, and the lien notice, all interconnected, all damning. She listened without expression, only nodding occasionally, the sound of her pen scratching steady across her notes. Finally, she looked up, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "The lien against Miss Ellis's property is hereby declared fraudulent and void. Further, given the repeated attempts at deception and financial theft, this court schedules an asset seizure hearing." Brian, slouched in his chair, went pale. Kara's hand twitched on his arm, but he shook it off, his eyes darting wildly as though searching for a way out that no longer existed. Louise leaned toward Marge, whispering, "He's suffocating, and we've only just started." The victory was sharp, but short-lived. That night, an envelope slid under Marge's door. The thick, heavy paper carried the county seal, the words stark in black print. She tore it open slowly, her heart steady but her breath caught. Summons. Restitution trial. Full damages hearing scheduled. Marge set the paper on the table, her hand resting on top of it. The fight had grown teeth. What started with a slammed door was about to reach the full weight of a gavel. The courthouse smelled faintly of floor polish and nerves. The restitution trial was set for the largest courtroom in the building, its oak-paneled walls rising high, the American flag looming above the judge's bench. The benches were full, neighbors, curious locals, even a few reporters. Everyone wanted to see how far a son could fall when a mother pushed back. Brian Ellis sat at the defendant's table, his tie crooked, his jaw working like he was chewing gravel. Kara sat rigid beside him, arms crossed, eyes darting around the room as though searching for allies in a sea of judgment. Across the aisle, Marjorie Ellis sat straight-backed, her injured hand wrapped in clean bandages, placed deliberately on the table in full view. She didn't fidget, she didn't whisper. Her silence was heavier than any speech Brian could throw. Daniel Hurst rose first. His tone was quiet but carried weight, every word sharpened to cut. He began with the forged withdrawal slips, stacking each one like a brick in a wall. "The handwriting doesn't match." The banks flagged inconsistencies. "He stole not once, but repeatedly." Then came the forged power of attorney, blown up on a poster board for the jury to study. The jagged scrawl of Marge's name looked childish against her actual signature, which Daniel displayed beside it. He didn't even bother to disguise his fraud properly. Daniel said, "That tells you how little respect he had for his mother, or the law." Brian shifted, sweat beading at his hairline. Kara leaned in, whispering something, but the jury's eyes were fixed on the documents, on the pattern that couldn't be ignored. When Marge was called to the stand, the room hushed. She walked slowly, but not timidly. Her heels clicked against the tile, each step steady. She placed her left hand on the Bible, then sat, her right hand, the bruised one, resting on her lap. Daniel guided her gently. "Mrs. Ellis, can you tell us in your own words what led to this case?" Her voice was soft, but each syllable carried like a bell. "My son slammed a car door on my hand, then he laughed. That bruise you see now, that was just the outside. The real damage was what he'd already been doing for years. Taking my money, using my name, calling me incompetent." She raised her bandaged hand, letting the jury see the swelling still present. This hand may look weak, but it is not as weak as the lies he's told about me. The jurors leaned forward, expressions tightening. Some shook their heads. Brian couldn't hold it in. He shot up from his seat, voice booming. She's lying, she's turning everyone against me. The gavel cracked. Judge Matthews's tone was cold steel. "Sit down, Mr. Ellis." Outburst recorded. He collapsed back into his chair, his face mottled red. Kara's hand hovered near his, but he shoved it away. Daniel pressed on, calling a bank manager to the stand, then a notary who had verified one of Brian's fraudulent filings. Each one spoke with crisp certainty. The paperwork was false, the signatures didn't match, the claims didn't hold water. Finally Daniel turned toward Kara. "Mrs. Ellis," he said smoothly, "perhaps you can clarify your husband's statements about how these funds were used." Kara stiffened, smoothing her blouse. We used them for household expenses. Groceries, bills." Daniel slid a printed screenshot across to the jury. Kara's own social media post, dated the day of the forged withdrawal, counting down to beach time, with a cocktail emoji. Her face paled. "That it was a joke," she stammered. The jury shifted, unimpressed. One woman in the front row raised her eyebrows, clearly unconvinced. Brian buried his face in his hands, muttering. The jury didn't look at him with sympathy. They looked at him with disgust, like a man who'd kicked a stray dog for sport. Daniel closed his file, his voice quiet but devastating. "Ladies and gentlemen, this isn't just about theft, it's about betrayal. A man who mocked his mother's pain, drained her accounts, and tried to erase her with forged authority. She stands before you bruised but unbroken. The law demands restitution. Justice demands it too." The silence in the courtroom was suffocating until Judge Matthews spoke, her gavel poised. "This court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Mrs. Marjorie Ellis. Restitution is ordered in full, including damages." The gavel slammed down, the sound echoing like thunder across the chamber. Brian's head snapped up, eyes wide. Kara flinched as if struck. Marge sat still, her hands steady on the table, a faint spark in her eyes. The courtroom that had once been his shield had now become his execution ground. The judgment landed like a hammer striking steel. Judge Matthews's words echoed in the courtroom, sharp and irreversible. Restitution in full, including damages. For Brian Ellis, it wasn't just a ruling, it was a sentence. For Marjorie Ellis, it was the first real breath of freedom in years. Outside the courthouse, the autumn wind whipped through Cleveland's streets. Brian stormed down the steps, jaw locked, fists clenched, while Kara scurried behind him in her heels. Reporters shouted questions, phones lifted to capture his red face. He shoved through them, muttering curses. The sound of cameras clicking followed him like gnats he couldn't swat away. Marge lingered at the top of the steps, her bandaged hand resting lightly on the rail. Louise was beside her, steady as ever. "Did you hear it, Marge?" Louise grinned, clapping her gently on the back. "That's the sound of justice." Marge didn't smile, but her eyes glimmered with something close. "It's only the beginning." Within days the machinery of law ground down on Brian's life. His paycheck at the auto parts warehouse was sliced by garnishment orders, the figures in his bank accounts drained by sheriff's levies. Every morning he checked his balances, hoping for a reprieve, and every morning the numbers dwindled further. He slammed his laptop shut one night, nearly sending it crashing to the floor. "They're bleeding me dry, Kara. I don't even have gas money left." Kara folded her arms, her voice like acid. "You promised me a life better than this. Do you think I married you to watch the sheriff pick through our scraps? Maybe I should walk before you drag me all the way down." Brian's head snapped up. "You wouldn't dare." Her laugh was sharp, humorless. "Watch me." Back on Maplewood Drive, Marge's house was alive with the smell of fresh coffee and victory. Louise poured steaming mugs as Daniel spread paperwork across the kitchen table. The ticking clock above the stove marked the rhythm of Brian's unraveling. Accounts seized, wages garnished. Daniel said, tapping each form as though conducting music. His calm tone carried an undercurrent of satisfaction. But we're not done yet. He's still holding assets we can force into play. Vehicles, electronics, furniture, all of it can go. Louise leaned back in her chair, smirking. Can't wait to see the look on his face when strangers paw through his things. Marge sipped her coffee, the bitterness grounding her. She didn't gloat, but her words carried quiet power. He wanted control. Now the only thing he controls is how fast he loses. Brian's reputation collapsed faster than his finances. At the bar where he once held court with boasts and loud laughter, men shifted stools away. Whispers followed him. That's the guy who stole from his own mother. One evening he walked in, only to find his old friends clustered at a different table. When he tried to join, they glanced at him, then turned their shoulders, closing ranks. Not here, Brian, one muttered without meeting his eyes. He left in a fury, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled. At home, the tension turned poisonous. Kara hurled a plate against the wall, shards skittering across the linoleum. I'm not going down with you, she screamed. You've ruined everything. The neighbors laugh at me, the court humiliated us, and now the bank's taking what little we have left. I should have left months ago. Brian grabbed her wrist, but she wrenched free, eyes blazing. Try to stop me and I'll tell the judge every damn thing I know. You think you're drowning now? You don't know what drowning feels like. The door slammed behind her, leaving Brian in a kitchen that smelled of broken porcelain and sour defeat. Meanwhile, Marge sat by her window, watching the autumn leaves whip down the street. The sheriff's cruiser slowed outside Brian's house, a deputy stepping out with a roll of notices in hand. She didn't need to lean closer to know what they were. An hour later, her phone buzzed with a photo text from Louise. The picture showed the bright orange notice plastered on Brian's front door, the bold letters screaming across it, auction pending. Marge set the phone down gently, her lips curving into the faintest of smiles. The man who had slammed her hand in cruelty was about to watch strangers bid on his pride. The chill of late October clung to the morning air as neighbors gathered at the end of Maplewood Drive. The sheriff's department had cordoned off Brian Ellis's front lawn, rows of folding chairs set up like an audience at a small-town play. Except this performance wasn't scripted. It was his humiliation, put on public display. Tables lined with electronics, tools, and furniture stretched across the driveway. The faint metallic scent of oil hung in the air from his beloved pickup truck, parked front and center with a fluorescent sticker slapped across its windshield. Auction item. Brian stood off to the side, jaw clenched, arms folded, his face stone, but the stiffness of his posture betrayed the truth. He was a man unraveling. Kara stood beside him for only 10 minutes before the whispers got too loud. Her high heels sank into the grass as she turned abruptly, snarling, "I won't be part of this circus." She stomped down the street, her perfume trailing sharp and sour in the cold air. The auctioneer climbed onto a small platform, his voice loud, practiced, the kind that could cut through chatter at county fairs. "We'll begin with the Craftsman tool set, full box, hardly used." Bids flew fast. Neighbors who had once endured Brian's arrogance now lifted their paddles with glee. Mr. Cunningham from across the street, who still remembered Brian mocking his old lawnmower years ago, snapped up the tools at half price. People laughed and clapped as the deals mounted, each sale a nail in Brian's coffin. Then came the truck. The crowd stirred as the auctioneer slapped its hood. Next up, 2016 Dodge Ram. Good condition, new tires, low mileage, who'll start me at $5,000. Hands shot up. One after another, the bidding climbing fast. Brian's jaw tightened with each number. He had polished that truck every Saturday, paraded it through the neighborhood, bragged about the horsepower. Now it was just another prize for strangers. When the gavel came down, sold 9,000 even. A cheer erupted. Brian didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on the pavement, lips pressed into a line so tight they looked bloodless. Marge had sat quietly for most of the morning, Louise at her side, sipping coffee from a thermos and watching the spectacle with measured calm. But when the auctioneer pointed toward a worn recliner, one Brian had dragged from house to house like a throne, something flickered in her expression. Ladies and gentlemen, next item recliner chair, leather used but sturdy, who'll start the bidding? Louise nudged Marge, smirking. That chair, you should buy it. Imagine him watching you walk away with his throne. Marge lifted her paddle just once. A neighbor countered with a modest raise, but when she held steady, the man chuckled and dropped out. Sold to bidder 73. Louise's laugh cracked through the cold morning. Full circle, Marge, he slammed your hand in his car, and now you've taken the very seat he thought made him king. Brian turned at last, his face twisted, eyes locking on his mother. But Marge didn't flinch. She rose, walked slowly toward the chair, and placed her bandaged hand on the worn armrest. Her touch was soft, but it felt like victory carved in oak and leather. By afternoon, the auction wound down. The driveway that once showcased Brian's pride now looked stripped, bare like bones after a feast. Neighbors drifted away carrying televisions, power tools, furniture, pieces of his life dismantled, sold, gone. Brian remained rooted to the grass, arms limp at his sides. He looked smaller somehow, shrunken. His breath came ragged in the cold air. Marge climbed into Louise's car, the recliner strapped comically in the back. She turned once to look at her son. For a fleeting second, she saw the boy he had been, the child who used to ask for second helpings of macaroni, who had once held her hand at the zoo. But then her hand throbbed against its wrap, and the memory vanished. The next morning, Daniel knocked at her door with a new envelope. His face carried that same calm ruthlessness. He's filed bankruptcy paperwork, Marge. It's official. She opened the envelope and scanned the legal jargon, the words stark on the page. Brian's surrender wasn't just financial, it was total. Her hand settled on the arm of the recliner she had bought from him, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself a quiet laugh. The stale air inside the bankruptcy courtroom carried the smell of old paper and stale coffee, the scent of endings. Brian Elwes slumped at the defendant's table, shoulders hunched, his once prized leather jacket looking too big for his shrinking frame. The clerk read the order aloud in a voice flat with finality. All remaining assets surrendered. Chapter 7. Bankruptcy approved. The words echoed like a death knell. Brian kept his head bowed, hands fidgeting in his lap. Around him murmurs rippled through the few onlookers who had come to witness the conclusion of his downfall. Kara wasn't among them. She had walked out the week before, her suitcase clattering down the porch steps, her voice shrill in the night air. "You're finished, Brian. I won't drown with you." The sound of her car door slamming had lingered longer than her perfume. Now, as the gavel struck once, Brian sat utterly alone. Across town, Marjorie Ellis received the news with quiet gravity. Daniel stopped by her house, placing the finalized papers on the table with a kind of deliberate ceremony. His crisp suit smelled faintly of cologne, his eyes sharp but softened for her sake. "It's done," he said simply. "The liens processed, the restitution secured. You'll receive disbursements from the estate liquidation within 60 days. He won't have access to a dime." Marge nodded slowly, her good hand brushing the edge of the stack. Relief didn't wash over her all at once. It settled like warm sunlight creeping through drawn blinds, cautious but steady. "This hand healed," she murmured, lifting her once bruised fingers, now pale and steady. "His name never will." Daniel allowed himself the smallest of smiles before gathering the last of the files. "This chapter closes here, Marge. But make no mistake, it closes because you forced it to." Louise insisted on marking the moment. That evening, she hosted a small dinner in her kitchen, the air rich with the scent of roast chicken and buttered rolls. The old radio hummed softly in the corner, half drowned out by the clink of plates and the occasional burst of laughter. Daniel sat at the head of the table, uncharacteristically relaxed, while Marge sipped wine from a crystal glass Louise had been saving for the right occasion. Louise raised her fork in a mock toast, to Marge, who finally proved that justice doesn't whisper, it roars. Marge chuckled. the sound low but genuine. No roaring here, just the quiet sound of him losing everything he thought he owned. The three clinked glasses, the moment warm, intimate, defiant. But outside that little celebration, Cleveland buzzed with the story. Word had spread through every corner of the city, at diners, in barber shops, over church coffee hours. The whispers grew into conversation, then into headlines. The next morning, a copy of the Cleveland Plain Dealer landed on Marge's porch, its ink fresh, its headline bold across the front page, "Mother Crushes Son in Court." Marge stared at the words for a long moment, the print smudging faintly against her fingertips. For years Brian had tried to define her as frail, gullible, controllable. Now his name was plastered across the city, not as a victor, but as a cautionary tale. She folded the paper neatly, set it beside her coffee, and allowed herself a long, steady breath. The war Brian had started with a slammed car door had ended here in public ruin, and she was far from finished. The chandeliers above the Cleveland Civic Center sparkled like captured starlight, their glow spilling across rows of polished tables draped in white linen. A string quartet played softly in the corner, the notes mingling with the faint aroma of roasted chicken and perfume. Tonight was not about ruin, it was about recognition. At the head of the room, a banner stretched across the stage, Annual Elder Protection Advocates Award Ceremony. Marjorie Ellis sat at one of the front tables, her posture straight, her bandaged hand long since healed, but still symbolic in the minds of everyone present. When her name was called, the applause rose like a wave, sweeping through the hall, louder than she could have ever imagined. Marge stood slowly, her heels clicking against the wooden stage as she approached the podium. The spotlight was warm on her face, but she didn't flinch. She looked out at the sea of faces, neighbors, lawyers, community leaders, even the mayor, and for a moment she thought of the night Brian had laughed, as her bones cracked in that slammed car door. Her voice carried steady through the microphone. "He thought I'd be silent. He thought I'd be small. But silence doesn't protect us. Standing does. I'm here tonight not because I was broken, but because I refused to stay broken." The applause thundered again, filling her chest like breath itself. Daniel sat at the next table, his usually composed face softened with pride. When the speeches ended, he approached her with a glass of sparkling cider, offering it like a toast. "You turned a private wound into a public shield, Marge. Without your meticulous records, none of this would have reached the light." Marge gave a faint smile. "You gave me the tools. I just wrote everything down." "No," Daniel corrected, his tone firm. "You built a case brick by brick. You didn't just win, you set precedent." Louise slid in beside them, her voice as sharp and amused as ever. "Don't let him lawyer-splain it, Marge. What you did tonight, you turned humiliation into history." She raised her champagne flute. "And I'll drink to that." They clinked glasses, the crystal ringing sweetly in the grand hall, but outside those bright walls, Cleveland's streets told a different story. Brian Ellis wandered them with no destination, his jacket hanging loose, his shoes scuffed. He drifted from convenience stores to bus stops, muttering to himself, ignored by passers-by, who once knew him as a loud, arrogant presence. At a diner window, two men whispered as he shuffled past. "That's him, the guy who stole from his own mother." Their words cut sharper than winter air. Brian lowered his head, quickening his steps, but the sting followed. His name, once a weapon, had become a scar. Back inside the Civic Center, Marge sat with Louise and Daniel as dessert plates were cleared away. She pressed her fingers lightly against the polished plaque she had been given, the engraving gleaming beneath the stage lights. "He thought I'd break," she said softly, more to herself than anyone else. Her eyes were steady, her voice calm. "I built instead." The words settled in the air, heavy with finality. Later that night, at her kitchen table, Marge opened a leather-bound notebook. The lamp cast a warm circle of light as she uncapped her pen. Her first words formed slowly but deliberately across the page, the ink bold against the paper, the slam that ended him. Her memoir had begun. The quiet on Maplewood Drive felt different now. No longer tense, no longer shadowed by Brian's rages. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that came not from silence, but from battles fought and won. Marjorie Ellis breathed it in every morning with her coffee, the smell of fresh grounds mingling with crisp autumn air. Her neighbors greeted her warmly now, not just with polite nods, but with respect. At the grocery store, the young cashier who once barely looked up from the scanner smiled and whispered, "I told my grandma about you. She said you're brave." Marge only smiled, carrying her bag of apples out with a steadiness that hadn't always been there. Courage didn't roar. It built quietly, until the walls of fear fell down. One Saturday afternoon, her grandchildren arrived, filling the house with laughter and the smell of pizza. They were old enough to understand what their father had done, but young enough to still see Marge as the pillar who had stood her ground. Her eldest granddaughter wrapped her arms around her tightly. "Thank you, Grandma, for not letting him break you." Marge smoothed the girl's hair, her chest tightening with both pride and sorrow. "No one breaks when they stand tall," she said softly. "Remember that." The younger ones chimed in with clumsy hugs, sticky fingers leaving smudges on her sweater. To Marge, those stains felt more like medals than mess. A week later, Daniel Hurst stopped by with his usual stack of papers, though this time his expression carried something lighter than business. "Marge, I've nominated you for the Cleveland Community Resilience Award," he announced. "Not just for winning your case, but for inspiring others to fight back." Marge blinked, caught off guard. "Me? An award?" Daniel's smile was rare but genuine. "You've become a symbol, and symbols matter." Louise, perched on the couch with her knitting needles clicking, grinned ear to ear. "Told you, Marge. You crushed him without raising your voice." The city noticed. Days later, Marge found herself wandering back into the courthouse. The marble floors gleamed under fluorescent lights, the faint smell of polish and paper lingering. She paused before a glass display near the lobby, an antique judge's gavel, wood darkened with age. A plaque below reading, "Justice is the hand that steadies the scales." Her fingers brushed the cool glass. She whispered, barely audible, "Justice doesn't slam doors. It slams names." The words felt like an oath, like a truth she had carved out with blood, bone, and persistence. That evening, back at her kitchen table, Marge opened a crisp white envelope from the local Legal Aid Society. They were requesting donations to expand elder protection programs, citing her case as an example. She read the letter twice, her lips pressing together in thought. Louise poured them both coffee, sliding the mug across. "You don't have to, Marge. You've done more than enough already." But Marge shook her head. "I didn't come this far to close the door behind me." She uncapped her pen, steady hand poised over the check. With a deliberate stroke, she signed her name. The ink dried on the page as her resolve deepened. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was building something bigger, something that would outlive Brian's ruin. The wind off Lake Erie carried the scent of salt and steel, sharp and cold, sweeping across the overlook where Marjorie Ellis sat with a steaming paper cup in her hands. The bruise that had once marred her knuckles was long gone, replaced by pale, unmarked skin. She held her coffee without pain, letting the breeze wash over her fingers like a benediction. Beside her, Louise leaned against the railing, scarf whipping in the wind. She sipped from her own cup and sighed. "You picked a good spot, Marge. Feels like a place you can breathe." Marge's eyes stayed fixed on the water, the waves breaking against the rocks below in a rhythm both endless and calming. "For the first time in a long time, I can." Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She didn't rush to answer it. She let it ring twice, then pulled it free. Daniel's voice carried over the line, clipped but warm. "It's official, Marge. Every order's finalized. He's barred from any claim on your estate. Every cent of restitution filed. Bankruptcy complete. Brian will never recover from this. The case is closed." Marge let the silence hang for a beat, the crash of waves filling the gap. Then she smiled faintly, looking down at her reflection rippling in the water. "Thank you, Daniel, for everything." "I only did my job," he replied. "You did the rest." Louise nudged her shoulder as she slid the phone away. Well? Good news? Marge's lips curved into a small smile. The best, it's over. Louise let out a satisfied huff. Over for him, maybe. For you, it's a beginning. She raised her coffee cup in a toast, eyes glinting. Marge touched hers against it, the sound of cardboard soft but certain. The following week she walked into the credit union where her son had once scribbled her name in lies. The teller greeted her with a bright smile. No hesitation, no suspicion. How can we help you today, Mrs. Ellis? Marge slid her ID across the counter. I'd like to open a new account, in my name only. The words felt solid, like stone laid for a foundation. When the papers were signed, the pen steady in her hand, she tucked the new account folder neatly into her purse. A life reset, clean and untouched. Her story traveled farther than she ever expected. At church potlucks, neighbors leaned close to whisper, "That's the woman who stood up to her son." At the grocery store, a stranger touched her arm gently. "You gave me courage. My daughter's been stealing from me. Now I know I don't have to be silent." The whispers weren't pity anymore. They were respect. They were recognition. One evening, back at the Overlook, Marge and Louise sat side by side as the sun dropped low, the lake turning copper under its glow. The air smelled faintly of rain, the waves slapping the rocks with steady persistence. Louise broke the quiet first. "If he could see you now, he'd choke on it. You're stronger than he ever imagined." Marge nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "He thought breaking me was power. But I proved the only real power was the law and the truth." She took a final sip of coffee, let the cup rest on the bench beside her, and pressed her hand, whole-heeled, unbroken, flat against the railing. The steel was cool beneath her skin, anchoring her to the moment. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. "He slammed the car door on my hand, so I slammed the gavel on his name." The lake swallowed the words, and carried them out to the horizon, where they belonged.